The wind carried dust and silence across the wide, bone-colored plains, brushing the porch rails of the Harrow Ranch like a memory it meant to unsettle. Silas Harrow sat with one boot resting on the rail, hat tipped low over his brow, gaze fixed on the endless line where earth met sky. The wind had shifted that morning. It smelled faintly of iron and something sweet. Rain maybe. Or something else trying to be new. He didn't move as the wagon approached, just narrowed his eyes, watched the mule's slow plod through the dirt. He'd paid coin 2 weeks past in the town of Dalebrook. A woman for hire, not for warmth or bed, but for laundry, bread, and the stubborn dust in every crack of the house. Housekeeper, they called it in town. Though Etta from the general store had muttered, "That man needs more than soap and supper," and he'd walked out before hearing the rest. The wagon creaked to a halt. The driver gave no nod, no greeting, just helped her down and left with coins Silas had already mailed. That was the way of it, quiet and clean. He preferred it that way. She stood before him now, boots worn near to splitting, dress plain and gray like morning fog. She didn't look up. Just adjusted her shawl and kept her hands close to her waist like she wasn't sure if she was staying or running. He cleared his throat. "You'll find the wash basin out back. Pantry's yours. Room enough for a cot." Still she didn't lift her eyes. Just gave a slight nod and moved toward the house. The wind picked up her skirt hem and for 1 second he saw the limp. A soft drag of her left foot, masked quickly but there. She didn't favor it in a way that asked pity, just moved like she was used to Payne's company. Silas watched her disappear inside. The screen door moaned and shut behind her. He didn't follow. The day passed quiet. She moved like shadow, appearing only in the edges of his vision. By dusk the windows gleamed. The hearth had no cobwebs. His supper sat waiting, stew and bread still warm. No words. No noise but the tick of the grandfather clock. She'd gone to the pantry by then, the door cracked just enough to let lamplight spill. He ate in silence. The stew was good. Not remarkable, not strange, just right. Like something he hadn't had since before the world felt hollow. When he rose to clear the bowl, he noticed a fresh rag folded beside the sink. Lavender soap clung faintly to the air. The next morning she was sweeping the porch before sunrise. He stepped outside and she paused, not startled, just still. He studied her in the hush between them. She had dark hair, braided tight, and skin like she'd worked fields in every season. Her hands were red raw, scrubbed clean but mapped with old burns and fresh scars. "Name?" he asked, more out of practicality than welcome. She kept sweeping. Then, soft like dust on cotton, she said, "Marybelle." He nodded once. She didn't offer more. Days passed, each one folding into the next like pressed linens. She cleaned with quiet dignity, never idle, never intrusive. She moved through the house as if asking permission from the walls, placing things where they belonged, not where she pleased. She left food out for him without expectation. When he returned from mending fence posts or feeding the cows, he'd find cornbread cooling or a pot of coffee left warming on the hearth. She rarely looked him in the eyes. But he noticed the way she paused when thunder rolled in the distance, how her shoulders tightened at the sound of a man's voice in town. Once, when a traveling peddler asked if she was his wife, she disappeared into the barn and didn't speak the rest of the day. He didn't ask questions. Not about her limp. Not about the small scar on her collarbone. Not about the nights she didn't sleep, just sat near the hearth with a quilt pulled up and her gaze locked on some point far beyond the walls. One afternoon, he came in from chopping wood and found her on the floor, scrubbing beneath the long-forgotten bookshelf. She was humming. Soft low. A tune with no words, the kind of melody women used when rocking a child. It stopped the moment she saw him. She dipped her head. "Sorry." He didn't answer. Didn't move. Just stared at her as a strange warmth coiled inside him. Not desire. Not yet. Just something soft. She stood slowly. The limp was more noticeable when she was tired. He stepped aside to let her pass. Their shoulders brushed. Neither spoke of it. The next evening the rain came. Not gentle drizzle, but a lashing storm that bent trees and turned dirt to rivers. He was checking shutters when he saw her out near the clothesline trying to pull in the linens. The wind had tangled them like ghosts. Her hair had come loose, clinging to her cheeks. Water poured off her shoulders. She looked like someone who didn't mind being soaked, like she'd been wet longer than she'd been dry. "Leave it," he called louder than he meant. She didn't. He went out, boots sinking in mud. Took the clothespins from her trembling fingers. Inside. Now. They stood dripping in the kitchen afterward. Neither moved. Then she turned, pulled a dry towel from the cabinet and handed it to him. When their fingers touched, he noticed her hand was cold. She left before he could say anything. That night he left his plate in the sink instead of cleaning it. The next morning it was washed, dried, and returned to its place. A small thing. But it rooted deep. On the 6th day she moved the old rocking chair by the fire. It had belonged to his wife. No one had touched it in 4 years. He found her kneeling beside it, dusting the legs with reverence. Her fingers paused on the curve of the armrest. She didn't look up. That was hers, he said, rougher than he intended. She nodded, still kneeling. It's a good chair. He didn't reply. She finished and stood slowly. The room felt like it was breathing. That night, the chair rocked empty beside the fire, and he didn't move it back. A week passed. Then 2. She began speaking more. Little things. We're low on flour. Storm coming by the smell. That calf still limping? Nothing deep. Nothing tender. But her voice filled the spaces the wind used to take. On a Wednesday, he came in to find her hanging dried herbs above the hearth. Lavender. Rosemary. The house smelled like someone cared again. He sat at the table. Watched her work. You ever cook for a large family? She looked over her shoulder. Once. That was all she said. That was all he needed. He found himself watching the clock now, wondering when she'd start the fire, when the scent of her bread would fill the rooms. She'd begun wearing her hair down sometimes in the evening, tied with a bit of ribbon. She never wore color, but once her sleeves had a touch of sky blue. It startled him. He liked it. Then came Sunday. A knock on the door. He opened it to find Etta with a basket of preserves and a raised brow. Thought I'd check if she was real, Etta said, stepping inside. Marybelle stayed in the corner, quiet but composed. She's done well by this place, Etta remarked, eyes roaming the clean shelves, the polished windows. You smile more now, Silas. I don't smile, he muttered. Etta grinned. Not with your mouth, maybe? When she left, Silas turned toward the kitchen. Marybelle was there, stirring something in the pot, back straight, hair pinned. Folks'll talk, she said softly. He leaned against the doorframe. Let him. She glanced back, eyes flickering, uncertain. You didn't want company. I didn't want noise, he corrected. You're not noise. She returned to the pot, stirring slower. That night after supper he found her near the porch. She stood under the stars, arms folded, eyes full of something too big to name. You can stay as long as you like, he said behind her. She didn't turn. Just nodded once, the smallest of movements. And for the first time in 4 years, the house behind them felt like a place meant to be returned to. Not just a shelter. A beginning. By the 2nd week, the dust in Silas Harrow's house had stopped rising. It didn't cling to the shelves like a warning or gather in corners like sorrow. It settled, finally, like everything else that had fought the wind long enough. And Marybelle too began to settle, not fully, not openly, but the shift was there. You could see it in the way her shoulders eased during breakfast, or how she lingered a moment longer by the stove when the morning light came through the window just right. She started tending to small things without being asked. Sewing a rip in the curtain's hem. Replacing the cracked mug he always used with one that matched the plates. When he asked why, she just said, some things don't need to be broken to be replaced. Just ready. Silas noticed himself watching her more, how she tied her apron strings, how she tilted her head when listening to the wind. She was not graceful in the usual sense. Her limp gave her a slow gait, and her movements were deliberate, almost cautious, like she'd learned the hard way that the world punished haste. But there was a quiet precision in everything she did, a calmness that softened the sharp edges of the house. They didn't speak much in those early days, but what they did say mattered. She asked him once if the cows had names. He said no. She didn't ask again. But the next day he heard her call the oldest one Myrtle when she thought he wasn't listening. The name stuck. In town, tongues began to wag. The widow Etta stopped by with dried apples and gentle questions. Marybelle kept her eyes down, nodded politely, and said nothing about her past. She knew how words got carried on prairie winds and twisted into barbs. Silas didn't offer answers either. He let them think what they would. Let them wonder. He hadn't hired her for company. He reminded himself of that daily. But the silence between them was beginning to feel less like emptiness and more like a shared space where neither had to explain too much. One night, after supper, he found her standing on the porch with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea. The stars stretched wide overhead, and the world smelled of sagebrush and cooling dirt. He stepped beside her, leaned on the railing. For a long while they said nothing. Then she asked, "Did you love her?" He didn't have to ask who. His answer came slow, pulled from someplace deep. "I think I did. In the ways I knew how." She nodded. That's all anyone can do, I suppose. She didn't speak of her own heartbreak, but it hung around her like a second shawl, one worn thin and threadbare. You didn't have to see the past to know it had clawed her raw. It was in how she flinched when boots scuffed loud against floorboards, in how she touched door frames gently, like making sure they wouldn't slam. A week later, a letter came addressed to Silas from a cousin in New Mexico. He read it twice, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the drawer beside his bed. Maribel didn't ask, though she saw the change in him. His hands were quieter that day, less certain. At supper he barely touched the stew. "You've been somewhere all day," she said softly, not accusing. "Just noticing." He glanced up. "He says he's dying. Wants me to come." "I won't." She didn't push. Just nodded and cleared the bowls. The following morning he found his work gloves stitched up with careful thread, laid beside a slice of fresh cornbread. No note. No smile. Just small mercies left like breadcrumbs. Spring threatened early that year. The land began to shift its bones, stretching under the last cold winds. Birds returned, calling from the bare branches as if reminding the earth how to wake up. Maribel took to sweeping the porch each morning, her limp less pronounced in the warming air. Sometimes she hummed again, though never the same tune twice. One day, after a trip into town, Silas returned to find her standing in the barn, palm outstretched, letting the calf nuzzle her fingers. "He still limps," she said, not turning. Silas stepped beside her. "Like someone else I know." Her lips curled, not quite a smile, but close. "We get by." He looked at her then, really looked. She was not young in the way that made people pause. She was not polished or delicate. But her face held something stronger, endurance shaped into grace. And it startled him, the way he suddenly wanted her to feel safe here. Wanted her to know that no one would ever raise a hand to her again. Later that week, she returned from the well with her hands blistered. He saw the blood through the cloth she'd wrapped them in and frowned. "You didn't ask for help. You didn't offer." A beat passed. Then she added, "But thank you anyway." He brought out salve and bandages, and she let him sit beside her on the step, his rough fingers wrapping the cloth with surprising gentleness. She didn't flinch, and that said more than words. One afternoon, the wind rose early. Maribel was inside, pulling the shutters closed when a knock came hard at the front door. Silas opened it to find a man with a face like scraped leather and eyes too sharp for kindness. "Looking for a woman," the stranger said. "Walks with a limp. Might have come through this way." Silas didn't move. "Plenty of women limp in these parts. Don't mean they're yours." The man's eyes narrowed. "She's not mine. But she owes me." "She owes no one," Silas said. Then shut the door. He told her later, and she didn't ask who. Just sat very still by the fire that night, her hands clutched tight in her lap. He let her be. But when he locked the door, he made sure she heard the bolt slide home. Days passed. Nothing more came of it. But the air felt tighter. And though neither said it, a change had come. That Sunday the sky turned a deep kind of blue, the kind that carried secrets. Maribel baked a peach pie with the last of the preserves. When she placed it on the table, Silas looked at her, really looked, and said, "You don't have to stay." Her hand paused on the edge of the table. "I know. But I'd like you to." Her fingers relaxed. "Then I will." That night, he found himself smiling at nothing, just the sound of her footsteps down the hall and the scent of lavender she left in her wake. And somewhere deep inside, a part of him that had gone cold stirred with warmth. The next morning he came down to find her humming again, soft and sure. She looked up, caught his eye, and for once didn't look away. Outside the land was blooming. And inside, something else had started to grow. Something neither of them had words for yet. But it was there. Quiet. Steady. Just like her. The days lengthened, warmed, and softened into something like peace. The wind that once scoured the prairie now passed through gentler, whispering grass. And in the Harrow house, time began to behave differently. It was not rushed or marked with loneliness, it was shared. Maribel no longer asked what to do, she simply moved with the house's rhythm. Silas no longer measured her presence. He noticed when she wasn't in the room, when the kitchen held only its stillness and not her hum. He caught fever sometime in early May, the kind that crept in through a man's bones without warning. It started with the ache in his joints, then his breath came short, then the fire in his skin. Maribel found him half collapsed beside the woodpile, too stubborn to call for help. She didn't panic. Just hauled his arm over her shoulders and walked him back to the house one slow step at a time, murmuring quiet nothings like she might to a scared child or broken horse. For 3 days, he drifted in and out of sleep, waking to her voice reading softly from a worn leather-bound book, or the cloth she pressed to his brow, always cool, always smelling faintly of rosemary. When he shivered, she wrapped him tight. When he sweated through the sheets, she changed them without complaint. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for thanks. She simply stayed. One night, in the blur of his fever dreams, he called out a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years, Lena, and then fell back into unconsciousness. The next morning, when he woke with clearer eyes and a tongue dry as dust, he found her sitting in the rocker beside his bed. She wasn't crying, just looking down at her hands folded in her lap. "You said her name," she murmured without looking at him. His throat ached to speak. Wasn't trying to. "She must have meant something," she said like a quiet fact. He struggled upright, grimaced. "She did. But that's long gone. I see it clearer now." She rose, fetched water, placed it in his hands. He drank slowly. When he handed it back, their fingers brushed and neither pulled away. "You've taken care of me," he said, voice gravelly. "You do the same." He looked at her then, not with fevered eyes but with a kind of gaze that sees plainly, no illusions, no shadows. "You make the silence easier." Her lips parted, but no words came. Still, something shifted in the space between them. Not affection, not yet, but a mutual understanding that something real had begun. By the week's end he could walk again. She tried not to hover, but her eyes followed him, watchful in a way he hadn't known he needed. That night, as they shared stew by the fire, he broke a long-held rule and said, "You ever miss anywhere?" She stirred her spoon. "Now and then. Mostly what never happened, though." He nodded. That kind of grief he understood. As the season unfolded, Silas began noticing things with new eyes. He saw how the house had changed, not just in cleanliness but in spirit. It smelled like food and herbs and life again. The air moved like it had room to breathe. She had done that just by staying. One afternoon he found her sitting under the cottonwood tree near the edge of the property, sewing a button back on her dress. The breeze lifted her hair, and for a moment she looked like someone who'd always belonged to the land. He sat beside her in the grass, not speaking. Just close enough that their elbows brushed. "I used to think quiet was the same as peace," she said after a while. "But it's not. Quiet can be full of danger too." He nodded. "I used to fill my quiet with chores. Mornings were for work. Evenings for missing. Nights for nothing." Her fingers stilled in her lap. "And now?" He picked a stalk of grass, twirled it between his fingers. "Now I find myself waiting for your hum. For your stew. For the way you leave the porch light burning." She didn't answer, but the wind moved her hair again and she let it. She didn't turn away. The next morning she was up early baking bread. He lingered in the kitchen longer than usual, watching her work. She didn't chase him off. When the oven door clicked shut, she turned and said, "Would you mind if I planted lavender along the fence?" He blinked, surprised at how much the question moved him. "You plant anything you like." Later that day he cleared a plot himself, pulled up the old weeds with hands that remembered younger strength. When she came out to see it, her expression was unreadable at first. Then she touched his arm and said, "You didn't have to." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." A storm rolled in that evening, fast and hard, with dark clouds clawing across the sky. The wind howled like it had old debts to collect. They ran to the barn together, gathering tools and covering feed. Rain came in sideways sheets, soaking them through before they could get back to the porch. She laughed, breathless, as he held the door for her. A real laugh, sharp and sudden, like it had startled even her. He stood dripping, looking at her, heart thudding in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. "You laugh like it's something rare." She caught her breath, smiled without apology. "It is." They stood there, rain drumming on the roof, thunder pacing overhead. He stepped closer. Not to touch, just to be near. The nearness was enough. "Why'd you come here?" he asked, not for the first time but with different weight. She looked past him into the storm. "I needed a place that wouldn't ask questions. A roof that didn't belong to someone cruel. I thought I'd stay a week. Maybe two. But then you let me be quiet without being small." He swallowed. "And now?" She met his gaze. "Now I think I've found what quiet ought to feel like." That night, neither of them lit a lamp. They let the fire glow low and sat near it in the dark, the storm washing the past off the walls. Later, she found the old wooden carving on the mantel. One of Lena's, a horse in mid-gallop, rough but full of motion. She picked it up carefully, then set it on the windowsill beside a bundle of dried lavender. Silas saw her do it and didn't stop her. He let the past sit beside the present. Days passed. He found himself clearing space for her without thinking. He built another shelf in the kitchen. He moved his boots to the corner to make room for hers. He left her coffee cup on the table instead of returning it to the cupboard. He didn't ask himself why. He already knew. One morning she came in from feeding the chickens, hair damp with dew, cheeks pink from the cold. She pulled off her shawl and set it on the chair. "There's a fox digging under the henhouse again," she said, brushing dirt from her skirt. "Might be time to reinforce the fence." "I'll see to it," he replied, and then, almost without thinking, "Want to help?" She turned to him slowly. "You don't mind the company?" He shook his head. "I mind when it's not there." Their eyes held each other for a long time. Then she nodded. "All right." That afternoon they worked side by side, hammering in fresh boards, replacing the weak planks. He taught her how to tie the wire taut. She steadied his ladder. Their laughter came easier now, unguarded, like roots growing deeper without anyone needing to see. When the last nail was in, she leaned back against the post and looked up at the sky, clouds stretching like cream across the blue. "You ever think about starting over?" she asked. "I didn't," he said. "Not until you came." The wind rustled the grass. She said nothing more, but she didn't walk away. That night, as dusk turned the fields golden and birds called from the trees, he set 2 cups of coffee on the porch railing. She joined him without invitation, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. They sat in silence, the good kind, the earned kind. And when she rested her head lightly against his arm, he didn't move. Just let her stay there, still and safe. Inside, the fire burned low. Outside, the prairie breathed. And in between, something new had taken root. Something neither of them dared name, but both had already begun to tend. The morning began soft, like most had in recent weeks, with the smell of coffee curling through open windows and the sun spilling pale gold over the porch floorboards. Marybelle stood at the stove, hair still damp from the basin, humming low, turning biscuits in the pan. Silas leaned in the doorway, arms folded, just watching her. He had come to love that quiet song in her throat, the way she moved with care, as if this house mattered, because someone inside it finally did. They had not named what they were. No vows. No confessions. But something had bloomed between them, solid and unseen, like roots beneath the soil, felt more than spoken, trusted more than chased. Silas cleared his throat and stepped into the kitchen. "Town day," he said. Marybelle didn't flinch. She nodded, plating the biscuits with practiced ease. "I'll pack flour and salt to trade." "I'll handle that," he said. "You stay here." Her brow lifted just slightly. "Why?" "Because last time some fool thought it his business to speak to you like you were less than dust on his boots." She turned toward him, one hand resting light on the countertop. "I've heard worse." "Doesn't mean you should have to." She said nothing to that. But when he stepped closer, reached gently for her hand, she didn't pull away. "Let me shield you where I can," he said. "It's not about doubting your strength." Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "I know. But I don't like hiding." "You're not," he said. "You're home." That word stayed between them, warm and humming like something still growing. She gave a small nod, then pulled free and turned back to the pan. He left just after breakfast, saddle packed light, rifle slung loose. The wind had a sour edge that morning, and though he didn't believe in omens, he looked back at the house more than once before it vanished behind the rise. Marybelle spent the day tending the garden, then mending a tear in the bedsheet with slow, even stitches. The house felt still without him, but not hollow. It was different than the silence she'd once known. This one held space, not fear. It was near evening when the knock came. A single thump on the door. Not hurried. Not polite. It came like a debt being collected. She froze, fingers tightening around the needle. For a moment she thought of ignoring it, but instinct pulled her to the window instead. She peeked through the curtain and saw him, leaning against the porch post like he owned the land. The man from her past. Harlan Quinn. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year. But the memory never left. The way he spat when he talked, the way his hand had felt wrapped around her wrist like rope, how he'd sold her labor to crueler men when she could no longer bear his child. She stepped back from the window slowly, her breath already tightening. The door creaked open before she could move. "Well," he drawled, stepping inside without invitation, boots heavy on the floor. "Ain't this sweet? A real little homestead. You even got curtains. I should have figured you'd land somewhere soft." Marybelle didn't answer. She stood steady, hands hidden in her skirts. Harlan took his time looking around. "He treat you nice, this widower? Feed you? Keep you warm?" Still she said nothing. He pulled out a folded paper from his coat and dropped it on the table. "Got a claim here. Says you were bound to me. Still are. You ran before your term was up. That's theft, sweetheart. And I got the law to prove it. She stared at the paper, unmoving. I'm not here to drag you, he said, voice dropping low and slick. Not if he pays me fair. Call it a finder's fee. I walk no trouble. Otherwise I go to the sheriff. You know how they look at women like you. She breathed once, deep and steady. Then spoke, voice even as rain. You forged that. He shrugged. Doesn't matter. Paper's got a seal. And they don't look too close when it's a woman in question. You know that. She reached slowly for the iron poker beside the hearth, hand wrapping around its worn wooden grip. He saw, smiled. That what you're gonna do? Poke holes in me? Not sure your fine widower would thank you for blood on his floor. The door opened again. Silas stood in the frame, eyes sharp, shoulders squared. He took in the scene in a single breath. The paper on the table, Maribel's grip on the poker, the man's smirk. Back away, Silas said, voice low and sure. Harlan turned. Evening. You the one keeping her now? Silas stepped forward, closing the door behind him. She's not kept. She's chosen. Harlan's eyes gleamed. Well, now ain't that sweet? You think you got a say in what happens to her? I do. She's mine by contract. That's forged, Maribel said again. Harlan tilted his head. Maybe. Maybe not. But out here, who's gonna argue it when I ride into town? Think they'll take your word over mine? Silas didn't answer. He walked to the hearth and took the paper from the table. He read it once, twice. Then without a word, he turned and dropped it into the flames. The fire caught quickly. The seal curled and blackened. The man's eyes darkened. You think that solves it? No, Silas said. But I do think this will. And before Harlan could speak, Silas struck. It wasn't wild, not brawling. It was a single punch, clean, practiced, landed with the weight of a man who had not raised his hand in years but had never forgotten how. Harlan stumbled back, crashed into the table, knocked a chair over on his way to the ground. You ever come back here, Silas said, voice like gravel and thunder, I'll bury you in the dirt you came from. Harlan groaned, clutching his jaw. You'll regret that. I regret not doing it sooner. The man staggered to his feet, glared at them both, then stumbled out the door, spitting curses. They watched him mount his horse and vanish into the falling dusk, dust rising behind him like smoke. Silas turned, chest heaving. Maribel hadn't moved. She was still holding the poker. Still standing as though braced for more. He crossed the room slowly, gently took it from her hands and set it down. He's gone, he said softly. Her voice came quiet. Not always. He'll come back. Then let him. Silas looked her full in the face. You won't face him alone. She trembled then, not from fear but from something looser, breaking open. A grief that had no sound. He reached for her hands and pulled her gently into him. For the first time she let herself rest there. The fire snapped behind them. The wind outside picked up, tugging at the eaves, but inside the room was still. That night she didn't return to her pantry room. She sat beside him on the porch until the stars came, until the moon silvered the fields, until the quilt pulled around both their shoulders was warm enough to soften the chill. I thought I'd always have to leave, she whispered. He looked over at her. You don't. She closed her eyes. I didn't think I was someone worth staying for. You are, he said. You were before I even knew your name. They sat like that a long while, neither saying more. Words had done what they could. The rest was in presence. In the hush between two hearts that had come to understand each other in the spaces where no one else looked. In the weeks that followed, word of the incident spread through town. Some whispered. Some scowled. But most nodded when they passed Silas in the street, tipping their hats with respect. Even the sheriff, when asked about forged papers, only said, no crime in burning what should never have been written. Maribel took to planting lavender beneath the windows. The scent clung to the air, soft and sweet, even when the wind turned sharp. She cooked in his kitchen like it had always been hers. He built her a writing desk beneath the window. She mended his shirts before he even noticed they were torn. They spoke more now but still cherished the quiet. Sometimes their conversation was a touch, a glance, a cup of coffee passed hand to hand. Other times it was laughter over morning eggs, or shared silence beneath the stars. One evening he asked if she wanted him to take her name to town, to the clerk, to be written into the records properly. I don't need a paper to stay, she said. I know, he replied. But maybe it's time someone wrote you down for something you chose. She smiled then. A small, steady smile. All right. And so he did. The name Maribel Harrow appeared in the town ledgers 2 weeks later, written in clean ink, beneath a signature both of them made with careful hands. But it wasn't the paper that made it real. It was the way she still looked at him when he came in from the field, boots muddy, arms aching, and how he always found her waiting, porch light lit, supper warm, hands ready to hold his if he asked. Love hadn't arrived with thunder. It had moved in quiet, like a tenant who swept the floor before ever being invited. It hadn't knocked. It hadn't begged. It had simply stayed. And in the end, that was the only kind that ever mattered.